So this is the introductory shiur to Masechet Nedarim, which I had meant to give a week ago, but it didn't work out a week ago. So, but it doesn't matter. This introduction will take us through all of Masechet Nedarim and way, way beyond Masechet Nedarim. And that is the Gemara Daf Beis Amud Beis is questioning the order in the Mishnah. The sequence of the Mishnah is a little bit strange because it starts with Nedarim, then it goes to Charamim, and then to Shvuos, and then to Nazirus. And the Gemara wants to know why Charamim was wedged in between Nedarim and Shvuos. And the Gemara is going to try to prove that Charamim are basically a subcategory of Nedarim, and they don't belong to the category of Shvuos. Hence, the Mishnah puts Charamim right after Nedarim. So in order for the Gemara to convince us that Charamim really belongs to Nedarim as opposed to Shvuos, then we have to find out what's the difference between these two categories. Basically, what is the difference between a Neder and a Shvuah? So the Gemara says the following, that the fundamental difference between a Neder and a Shvuah is the following. Aidi de Tana. So we're on Daf Beis Amud Beis, and we're counting down from the top of the Amud 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the sixth line down, which starts with the word Aid. Okay, then? So Aidi de Tana Nedarim, and I'm going to skip the next three words just for pedagogic purposes. Tani Nami Charamim. Meaning, Charamim is an extension, or shall we call it a subcategory of Nedarim. And why is that? Because what is Nedarim? Let's go back. The mitzar Cheftza ale. Tananami Charamim, the mitzar Cheftza ale. So we now have one category called Nedarim. The subcategory of that is Charamim, because Charamim, like Nedarim, is called Mitzar Cheftza ale. The person prohibits the chayfetz upon himself. For example, he says that Kikar Zu Olai Kikarban, that this Kikar, this lechem should be to me like a carbon, it's asur. Or he says Achilas Kikar Ze Olai. And the same thing happens in the case of Charamim. He says that this kikar should be, to me, like a cherem, which means it should be also like a cherem. So that's one category. We have like avos and tolda. So the av is a neder, and the tolda is going to be what? The cherem. Then we have another category. This starts a different av malacha, and that's called shvuah. Slafuke shvuah. How is shvuah different? What's the contrast between shvuah and neder? Dika asar nafshe min cheftza. He prohibits himself from the object. He says, Shvuah shelo ochal kikar zeh. So in the first case of a neder, or for that matter, cherem, he says, Kikar zu osur alai. In the case of Shvuah, he says, I am osur in the kikar. Right? Shvuah shelo ochal kikar zu. And this, I believe, that's just my own commentary here, is the beginning of what we call the brisket derech halimut, which, by the way, is very, very popular today. I don't know if you're aware of this. There are literally thousands upon thousands of yeshiva students today, especially in Yerushalayim, that are studying the brisket derech. That's why Kodshim is taking over, because in Brisk, Kodshim is very, very prominent, high profile. So I sat on a plane now on my way back to Israel with a young man from a yeshiva. I had never heard of this yeshiva. And he tells me there are 800 students in this yeshiva. And we're all learning Kodshim based on Brisket Torah. This yeshiva that I never heard of. So what we're familiar with in Brisk is from Yoshua's yeshiva, Rab David's. All of this is taken over by the next generation, and that accounts for thousands of students that are learning Kodshim. But in addition to that, there's a proliferation of yeshivas that are learning with the Brisket Derech. And I believe that perhaps Reb Chaim's famous distinction between Gavra and Cheftza, which he applies in so many different sugyas in Shas, is based here on this Gemara. You ask, where did Reb Chaim come from? To create a whole methodology based on this fundamental contrast between Gavra and Cheftza, where did it come from? Rav Chaim was not Bada Milibo like Kinuyim according to Reish Lakish, right? He based it on this Gemara that distinguishes between a neder, which is ka'asar cheftza alei, as opposed to a shvua, which is ka'asar nafshe al cheftza. Now, the basic issue that we have to face here, and I'm going to ask you to open up your phones, perhaps, maybe in another Gilgul we'll be able to print it out for you, to Otzer HaYunim in the back of the Masechet Gemara, and this is the first Maracha on Gavra and Cheftza, which you'll see. It may say on the top left page Lamed Aleph, if you can find that, and it's Maracha Vav, and it's called Gidrei Isur Cheftza v'Gavra. So just by show of hands, I'm just curious how many people have that. Most of you have it? Okay, because that's helpful. I like to teach from a text. Now, the issue that's going to be addressed here is whether or not this is what I call substantial, this distinction between Gavra and Cheftza, Neder versus Shvua is substantial. Substantial meaning that it has halachic ramifications. There are nafkeminas la'alocha. Or is it just a matter of lashon? In other words, basically both a neder and a shvua, according to the second approach, are equal. There are no really halachic differences between the two. And in the second approach, what we're saying is whether we'll call it a neder or we'll call it a shvua depends upon the language that he uses to accept upon himself either the neder in the case where he starts with the chefetz, and he says that this chefetz is kikar asura alai b'neder, that's a neder, or he says shelo ochal kikar zu, or he starts with himself, and that's called a shvua, but it's just a matter of semantics. It all boils down to the question of whether you want to call it a neder or call it a shvua, and that's going to help us navigate through the sugyas. Sometimes we'll call it a neder, sometimes we'll call it a shvua, but at the end of the day, both neder and shvua are written in the Torah in the same pasuk that ends with the words lo yachel dvarav, which means that there's an isa lava bal yachel that applies equally to both neder and shvua. And it's not like there are other aspects of a neder that don't apply to a shvua, other aspects of a shvua that don't apply to a neder. They're basically all the same. And this is the way many achronim understood the Ran, because the Ran, which is the major pirush that we have on Masechet Nedarim, we don't have Rashi, seems to assume whenever he analyzes, is this a neder, is this a shvua, he always analyzes the language that he uses. He never indicates that there are nafkeminas la'aloch. However, having said that, just to be yotzezayin, so to speak, let's go according to the main thrust of all the Rishonim and all the Achronim, that the difference between neder and shvua, between Isa Gavra and Isa Cheftza, is substantial. There are many nafkeminas. And if you take a look on page Lamed Beis, and this goes on to page Lamed Gimel, that's the second page and the third, you will see an analysis of the various nafkeminas between an Iser Neder and an Iser Shvua. And that appears here just one second, on page Lamed Beis. So, for example, you'll see Aleph, right? If you're looking on page Lamed Beis, you'll see on the right column Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Dalid, Hey, Vav. He's got a list of 6 different nafkeminas between a neder and a shvua. Let's go through them. And this will be sort of like a summary of page Lamed Beis, and then we'll get into more substantial questions about other Isurei Torah, like Nevelis and Trefus and Shkotzim and Ramosim and Ekdeshos and so forth and so on. Are they to be classified and defined as an Isur Cheftza or as an Isur Gavra? But now we've come to the conclusion so far that the Gemara is explicit and outspoken that Neder is an Isur Cheftza, Shvu is an Isur Gavra, and now we want to know the nafkemina. So the first nafkemina is that a Neder is chal on a dvar mitzvah. With regard to a Shvua, we have a principle of ein Shvua chal al Shvua. Every mitzvah in the Torah, all 613, we have the principle of mushpa v'yomed me'ar Sinai. So if a person takes a shvua that I won't sit in the sukkah on sukkahs, that shvua is not chal at all, because he is already mushba v'yomei. The Torah has imposed upon him a shvua. Atem nitzov mayom kulchem es asher yeshno po es asher einenu po hayom, in the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah. Or if a person says, I will eat a davar osur, I will take a shvua that I'll eat in a vela treifa, the shvua is not chal because he's already mushpa v'yomed, and we have a principle that shvua cannot be chal to be mevatel a shvua. So the Torah commands me to go into a sukkah. I take a shvua that I won't go into the sukkah. My shvua can't be chal because I already have a shvua that commands me to go into the sukkah. However, neder will be chal. So if I look at this sukkah, and I declare that this sukkah is asur alai bin neder, I will not be able to fulfill my mitzvah of sukkah with this sukkah because the sukkah is asura bin neder. And all this is based on the fundamental distinction, as we said before, between an Isur Cheftza and Isur Gavra. The Torah didn't say that you have to sit in this sukkah. So therefore, when I take the neder that I won't sit in this sukkah, I won't benefit from this sukkah at all, the sukkah becomes asura. Once there's an Isur neder on the sukkah, I can no longer fulfill my mitzvah of yeshiva b'sukkah in that sukkah. Is that clear? But in the case of a shvua, as we said before, and I take a shvua that I won't sit in sukkah, well, the Torah says you're obligated to sit in sukkah. And therefore the shvua is not.
What happens if you make a ned? That's an example where you potentially could still do the mitzvah, so the neder didn't cancel out. What happens if it's in a case where you make a neder on the only possible?
The same thing would be chal. Right? Let's say you say all the sukkahs on the face of the globe are asuras alai b'neder. You will not have a possibility of fulfilling the mitzvah of sukkah. And why is that? Because the Torah did not say anything about the sukkah. So each particular sukkah is included in your neder. And it becomes a sukkah asura in such a way that you can't sit in any sukkah whatsoever.
You only get one shot at it. And you make a neder, this son that was just born, I'm not going to do it. This son will not be pitcher. Not that I'm not going to do a pitcher. You lush on the neder.
So that's not that case.
There's no object.
Right. That case is going to come under a different klal, which we'll get to soon, called neder v'loshen shvua. But I'm talking about a neder, mamish a neder, an isa cheftza, and the Torah doesn't say anything about the cheftza, and therefore, even though it'll turn out that I can't fulfill the mitzvah, the neder is chal. Why? Because there's no head-to-head collision between the neder prohibiting the cheftza and the chiv mitzvah on the gavra to sit in the sukkah. But in the case of shvua, there's a head-to-head collision between my obligation to sit in the sukkah and the shvua that I took not to sit in the sukkah. Second nafkamina. Again, Rabbi said, what I would suggest, just, again, the picture will hopefully get a little clearer as we go along. Second nafkamina. What about a shvua on a davar she'ein bo mamish as opposed to a neder on a davar she'ein bo mamish? In the case of a shvua, by definition, a shvua is chal on a davar she'ein bo mamish. So, for example, if I take a shvua that I won't sleep, which is a classic case of a shvua, or I won't smoke, which, by the way, for someone who's addicted to smoking is not a good idea, but he took a shvua that he won't smoke. In such a case, it's a davar she'ein bo mamish. Why? Because the Isur is on a maisa, on an action. Shvua always prohibits me from implementing a certain action, and an action is called a davar she'ein bo mamish. It's not an object. A neder, on the other hand, could never be chal on a davar she'ein bo mamish. So he takes a neder not to do X, Y, or Z. That neder could not be chal as a neder. Again, it might be chal as a shvua, as we'll soon see later with the din of Yadayim and so forth and so on. But as a neder per se, it cannot be tofes as a neder because it's a davar she'ein bo mamish. Any action is considered a davar she'ein bo mamish. Interesting, the Gemara is going to have later on in Masechet Nedarim that he could take a neder on a yom, and he could say yom zek yom shemeis bo aviv, which is called atfasa, and he's matvis in the cheftza of a yom. That's a fascinating concept because a yom is l'chora davar she'ein bo mamish. But the Gemara says that even a yom is considered in the halacha as an entity, and I can take a neder in which I extend the Isur on this yom, which is on the yard side of my father, to this yom, which is not a yard side, and the neder is chal. But in any event, the bottom line is this is the most fundamental distinction between neder and shvua. Neder is always on the maisa, otherwise known as the Gavra, and the neder is always on an object, which is the Cheftza. That's the second nafkamina. Again, I think at the end of the day, after we get through these 6 nafkaminas, we're all going to be convinced that this so-called Ran that says so-called that neder and shvuah is only semantical is not correct at all. Because you're going to see over and over again all the nafkaminas, and this is substantial. Now the third nafkamina. Is there such a thing as hatfasa with regard to a shvuah? And the answer is no. You can't be matvis a shvuah onto an action, because hatfasa means that you extend the kedusha or the isur from object A to object B. That's what a neder is in the case of hatfasa. So you say, Kikar zu alai ki karban. So I'm taking the kedusha sakarban and I'm extending it to this loaf of bread that's here on the table. That's called hatfasas cheftza, and that operates in Nedarim. But in the case of shvuah, there's nothing to be mamshich kedusha because you're not dealing with a cheftza. So take a look at number Gimel. He quotes the Rosh and the Ran. Matvis sha'omer al chefet zeh kazeh yesh chiluk bein neder l'shvuah. And he says the following: in neder shayeches hatfasa, but in shvuah lo shayeches hatfasa. They should be neder chefetz nitvas be'isur ubekedusha. And now through hatfasa, he's mamshich. He extends the kedusha of the carbon onto this kikar, and hence he has a neder. But aval b'shvuah shachefetz heter gomorhu. Ein shuv mashmos zeh kozeh. Again, by definition, we said in the first nafkamina that a shvu is not chal on a dvar mitzvah. So the shvu is only chal on a dvar heter, which is neither a mitzvah or an avera, and therefore there's no object that has an iser in it. In the case of a shvu, that could allow you to be mamshich onto something else, because shvu is an iser gavra. Now, I'd like to mention at this point the Rosh. If you go back, let's not lose our place. If you have the actual Gemara, okay, no one has the Gemara, so I don't have to mention that. But I would love you to buy a Gemara in Nedarim. But the only thing is, it's 5 volumes, 125 shekel a pop. But the Rosh asks the following question: a Nazir is enjoined from drinking wine, so that yayin is a cheftza di surah. As far as a Nazir is concerned. Says the Rosh, I don't understand. If we go back to the Mishnah, Naziris is listed as number 4, means it's listed after Shvuah. So that would indicate, according to the structure of the Mishnah, that Naziris is a subcategory of what? Shvuah. Of Shvuah. And it's fascinating to me that the Rosh comes up with what I think is the most brilliant, but yet almost simple answer to this question. Says the Rosh, and this is on Daf Beis Amid Beis. You have the Rosh, correct, in your Gemaras? Dibra Maschil lafuke shvua di osar nafshe min cheftza. Do you see it? It's like the third paragraph in the Rosh. The first paragraph is mishum de neder. Second paragraph is nedarim, and then the third paragraph lafuke. You have it? Yeah. He writes the following. Lafuke shvua the osar nafshi min cheftza, and he answers the following assumed question, implicit question: how do you know that in the case of shvua? How did the Gemara know this? That he's answering himself from the cheftza. The chsiv nefesh. Do you see the Torah in shvua starts with the emphasis on the nefesh? Ki tishava shenishba shelo yaseh davar zeh. So the nefesh takes a shvua that he won't do the following thing, and that's called an isagav. Vin nazir. Why is that a shvuah? Afal pi shenesar biyayin, which would mean that it's an isa cheftza. Eino nesar hayayin olav. It's not automatic that the yayin became asur on him. Ela begufo toli anazirus sha'omer hareini nazir. So once he accepts upon himself Naziris, his guf changes. He is upgraded to Kedushas Nazir. That's the Gavra. And then Memela, what does Memela mean? As a result, meaning a repercussion of the fact that the Gavra has changed his essence, his status, and he sanctified himself b'kedushas nazirus, nesar b'yayin v'tiglachas u'betumah. So the bottom line is that according to the Rush, nazirus, even in the case of yayin, is really an isa Gavra. And this is going to be very important to us later on, so make a note of this, that an isa Gavra means we start with the Gavra. The Gavra has changed himself. He's upgraded or elevated himself to Kedushas Nazir, and as a result, he's also b'yayin. So we don't begin with the yayin. The yayin is not a given as a Cheftza d'Isura, but rather the yayin becomes asur as a result of the Gavra, as a result of Nazirus. Now we get to the fourth nafkamina.
So according to the Rush, it's not really, it's Nazirus is not a shvua or a neder. It's its own category. It's like
it's similar to shvua because according to the Rush, the lumdus, the deeper meaning of a shvua as an isa Gavra means that the Gavra changes himself such that now the Gavra is also to eat so and so. Whereas in the case of an Isur Neder or a Cheftza Isur, the Cheftza changes itself. There's something inherent in the Cheftza. I think we'll get to, I don't want to, be makdim as some uchar, but we'll get to this later. Nazir is clearly an Isur Shvua insofar as the Gavra is also in Yayin. Number Dal.
Can I ask a clarifying question? So there's sort of two formulations you could say for the Isser Gavra. Either, and I think Eli alluded to that earlier, is that that when you're talking about Isser Gavra, it's not per se that the Gavra has an Isser on it, as much as the verbs are what's Asr, right? And that's sort of, I think, the classic.
The actions, meaning verbs, actions. Right.
But you could also say, no, Isser Gavra means, just like you could say that chair is Asr for me to sit in it, my body is Asr to sit in the chair, and you could say that that's Shvua from Gavra. Is the Rosh saying that when we say Isser Gavra, we mean there's a change in the Gavra of the person? Or is he saying that by Nazirus is really a third category? There's that object, which is Isser Cheftza. There's my relationship to the object, which is Isser, which is Isser Gavra. And then there's a change in the person, and that's Nazirus.
Okay. Could be, you're right. And again, we'd have to study Nazirus in order to come to some conclusion. We'd wonder whether there's an afkamina.
Part of why I'm asking that is because we do have the cases in Nazirus or V'chein Ani, right? There's all those cases over there. So
V'chein Ani, according to the Rush, means I've changed the Gavra, right?
So that is Hatfasa.
Well, no, it's not Hatfasa. I'm not taking the Kedushas Nazir of Ruvain and extending it to me. What I'm doing is I'm making a declaration that I should be Niskadesh just with Kedushas Nazir, just like Ruvain is Niskadesh.
Isn't that like Charamas?
No, in Charamas, what I'm saying is that this object should be a Cherem to me. That's clearly an Isur Cheftza.
What I'm saying, but in terms of extending the Kedusha.
Let's see if we can, again, I hope that we'll go on and we'll get more. Number Dalet, I just wanted to go through quickly the first six. And then try to figure out what is an Isur Cheftza, what is an Isur Gavra. He says number 4, Neder could be Chal on a Shvua, right? So Kigon, if you take a look at the third line in number Daled, Shenishba Lechol Kikar Zeh. So he already took a Shvua that'll eat this Kikar, and then he says about the Kikar, he declares Kikar Zu Asura Alai B'Neder Kikonam, like a korban. And since the shvua is only chal on the action of a person, which means that he took a shvua that he'll eat this kikar, now there's room to generate an iser on the kikar itself, which is called a neder. So therefore, neder is chal on a shvua. Basically, what we're saying here is a repeat in just a different formulation of the first nafkamina that we said that you could take a neder to aser a sukkah, even though the Torah commands you to sit in the sukkah. Why? Because the Torah is commanding us on the Ma'aseh Gavra, the yeshiva b'sukkah. But the sukkah became a sukkah asura olav midin neder. So too, if the shvua would obligate him to eat the kikar, but now the assumption is, the shvua is meaningful because you have to eat the kikar, because the kikar is a kikar shel heter, right? You can't take a shvua on an achila asura because he's mushba v'yomed. Now, by imposing the neder on the cheftza, on this kikar, and he's saying kikar zu asura, he is enjoined from fulfilling his shvua to eat that kikar because there's still room for the neder to be chal on the cheftza. Once again, you see over and over again that the distinction between Isur Gavra and Isur Cheftza is really substantial. it's very meaningful. And whether the shvu is chal on the Gavra as a Maisa Gavra, or the shvu is chal on the Cheftza as a neder because he asks the Cheftza, has tremendous ramifications. And then we get to number Hey. Shvua eina yechola lachila elal atzma. Interesting. When you own an object, you can take a neder that will impose an iser on this object for the entire world. So it means that after I take this neder and I say kikar zu asura al kol olam, again assuming we don't have a problem. He owns the kikar, so I can make this kikar asura on everyone. But in the case of a shvu, which is only on the Gavra, the Maisa Gavra, I can prohibit myself from eating the kikar. I can't prohibit you with the shvu from eating the kikar. Again, a fundamental distinction in halacha between neder and shvu. And that's number 5. And finally, number 6 is the following. This principle of mitoch lav atashomei hein or mitoch hein atashomei lav, atashomei lav, and so forth and so on. This is machlokas from Meir and the Chachamim that repeats itself over and over again throughout Masechet Nedarim. And the question is, when do you say the principle? When do you apply the principle of mitoch lav atashomei hein? And here is going to be a difference between an Isa Cheftza like a neder and an Isa Gavra like a shvu. Okay, this is a sugya on Daf Tez Zayin, which Bali Neder I'd like to talk to you about next week. We should be up to Daf Tez Zayin in the Daf Hayomi by next week. What do you say? No neder, no shvu. Bali Neder, Bali shvu. Okay. Now in the next section here, which is section number 5, number Hey, and section number Vav, the question is going to be asked whether or not there's an Isur Gavra in the case of Neder. Why? And all of this discussion here in number Hey is based on the pasuk Lo Yachal Dvaro. And the premise is that Lo Yachal Dvaro is an Isur Gavra. You are not, the Torah addressing you, are not allowed to make your dibur into chulin. Lo yechalel yoyases diburo chulin. He shouldn't desecrate the sanctity of his dibur. That's an Isur Gavra. So that we're fooling ourselves if we think that a neder is exclusively on the Cheftza. Every Isur neder, by definition, will set up an Isur Gavra as well. How does the Isur Neder set up an Isur Gavra? Once the Cheftza is Asur, if I were to enjoy the benefit of this kikar after I took a Neder, I am now violating my dibur. So I'm doing an action by eating the kikar that desecrates my dibur, and that comes under the lav of Bal Yachal Dvaro. So then we have the following. We start in a direction, the arrow goes in the direction beginning with what? With the Isur Cheftza. But what emerges at the end of this arrow is an Isur Gavra. Now, in the case of Shvua, it's a lot more complicated, and that's number Vav over here. Does a Shvua also set up an Isur Cheftza? And this is a fundamental machlokas rishonim. If you take a look, well, let's go back first to Neder. Does a Neder imply an Isur Gavra? He writes here, Mavur b'rishonim shebeneder yitachin sheyesh gam Isur Gavra. But yesh omrim sha'isur legavra humi bal yachel, v'yesh omrim shalom mitzad bal yachel el shegam b'neder. There are situations in which there's a chalos Isur Gavra as a result of his neder. So this gets into the whole issue of a person who takes a neder. He says, I'm taking a neder, but he uses a language of an Isur Gavra. So he takes a neder that he won't eat something. And the question is whether that still remains a neder because he defined it as a neder, even though it's an Isur Gavra. So you can combine neder and Isur Gavra. But others say that, you know what, I don't have to come up with this convoluted, complicated case where a man takes a neder on an Isur Gavra, but just simply Bal Yachal Dvaro, at the end of the day, indicates that every neder, because it's subsumed under the law of Bal Yachal, generates an Isur Gavra. However, he says the following: Ulam. I don't know if you see that paragraph. Yesh rishonim shesovrim shanedarim hem isur cheftza bilvad.
If the neder generates an Isser Gavra, doesn't that contradict the first distinction? Where we said, you can't, a neder could be chal on a shvua. If the shvua is on an Isser Gavra, now you just took the neder the other way,
No, but since you started with the cheftza, you already accomplished your goal of creating a cheftza d'isura.
So then it just stops.
And in the Mele, you can't be Makayim your shvua. You took a shvua to eat the kikar, but now the kikar is a cheftza d'isura. What we're saying in neder is that in addition to creating, we're not supplanting the Isa Cheftza, we're only adding to the Isa Cheftza. So on top of the Isa Cheftza, you also have an Isa Gavra Bal Yachal Dvaro. Don't disregard the Isa Gavra. But in the case of a Shvua to eat the Kikar, and now he takes a neder not to eat the Kikar, the neder becomes a Cheftza D'Isura, hence he cannot fulfill his Shvua. Now there's a paragraph here that starts with the word Nishpa. And I'd like you to give your attention to that paragraph. Nishba l'kayim es haneder. He took a shvua to fulfill his neder. Kigon. So there's a two-stage process. At time T1, Nadar konam alai kikar zeh. Okay, so now he has a kikar, and it's also b'neder. Achar kach, after he said that the neder is asur, that the kikar is asur b'neder, Nishba shalo yochlenu. He takes a shvua that he won't eat it. Could that shvua be chal? Such that if he violates and he eats it, not only did he violate his neder, but he also violated his shvua. We'll give him 2 sets of malchus. Now, this really depends upon what we discussed earlier. Because if every neder generates at the end of the day, in addition to the Isa Cheftza and Isa Gavra, then how could the shvua be chal that he won't eat this kikar? It's ein shvua chal al shvua. But if on the other hand, you go with the Rishonim that we saw in the paragraph ulam, and you'll take a look in the footnote number Yudalid, he identifies this with the Ritva, that a neder does not generate an Isur Gavra at all. It's only purely 100% exclusively an Isur Cheftza. Then the Gavra was not nesar as an Isur Gavra when he said kikar zu alai. Hence, there's room for the shvua to be chal as an Isur Gavra.
Wait, but you're saying then that the fact that it creates an Isur Gavra already relegates it to the class of shvua also?
No, it relegates it to the principle of mushpa v'yomim mar Sinai, meaning that the Torah has already imposed a shvua on him through Bal Yachel. Because when you were at Har Sinai, you heard the words Bal Yachel Dvaro. So that means that you can't eat this kikar, because if you eat this kikar that you prohibit upon yourself b'neder, you're going to make your diva into chulin. So the Torah has already established an Isa Gavra of Bal Yachel Dvaro. Then now to say I won't eat this kikar, it's ein shvua chal shvua. You're just repeating the same shvua that you've already taken Har Sinai of Bal Yachel Dvaro.
But is that a completely separate issue then? The Bal Yachel Dvaro?
Separate from what?
Separate from the original neder that he took.
I don't know, because what Easter is there in the neder?
He should get malchus twice then already, even on that without the second one.
Right, but again, there's no lav in the Torah that says, you can't eat this kikar. The only lav in the Torah that says you can't eat the kikar is Bal Yachel Dvaro. So I don't know if you can give him 2 sets of malchus. But if on the other hand, the shvua bichal, let's say if we go according to the Ritva, that a neder is purely and exclusively an Isa Cheftza, which has to be understood, and there is no Isa Gavra, then there's room for the, again, if we go according to the Ritva, that it's purely an Isa, what? Right, a purely an Isa Cheftza, then there's room for the Shvua to be chal, and he violates Bal Yachel Dvaro twice, once for his neder and once for his Shvua. And again, I emphasize this because it clarifies over and over again the distinction between an Isa Gavra and an Isa Cheftza as 2 separate, right, essentially 2 separate entities. The only thing is, we're perplexed by the following conclusion, that according to some Rishonim, every Isa Cheftza now in neder generates an additional Isur Gavra as well. But again, it starts with the Cheftza. So that distinction, we're not blurring, we're not ignoring that distinction. And then in number Vav, he has a whole discussion about whether we go in the other direction. Can you generate a shvua on a Cheftza? So for example, a person takes a shvua that this cheftza should be osur alai b'shvuah. So some will say that it's really not a shvuah, it's a neder, and a shvuah b'loshen neder is a kinui for a shvuah. And others would say that the shvuah could be chal on the cheftza, which sounds like a contradiction in terms. In fact, if you'll see the paragraph ulam, this is, I think, an intuitive response to this question. He says that the opinion of Tosas in the name of Rabbeinu Elchanan, or the opinion of the Ran, is that lo shayach iser cheftza b'shvuah. If you're taking a shvuah in the language of an iser cheftza, and you're saying shvuah kikar zu alai, that shvuah cannot be chal. It doesn't register on the Richter scale because it's not a shvuah, and you didn't take a neder, you took a shvuah. Okay. Now we get to the main issue for today. Mahus, you see this number Zion. Iser cheftza b'surei Torah. The Torah prohibits many, many different things. There are many different isurim. So if you take a look at a paragraph that starts ubehekdem on the left column on page Lamed Gimel, yesh levarer hageder b'shar isurei Torah. Now I'm going to ask you for an intuitive response to the following question. I'm hope that we all have the same intuition. I'm not sure, but I want to try. When the Torah says, "Thou shalt not eat nevela or treifa or shkatzim v'ramosim," what would you say? What would be your intuitive response? Shall we classify that as an iser cheftza or as an iser gavra? Anybody? What do you say? Cheftza. I don't know. I hope everybody's on board with that. The Torah is saying this nevela is awesome. This sheketz is awesome. That sounds like an iser cheftza. And the truth is that all the Rishonim seem to assume that shar isurei Torah are an iser cheftza, with the exception of the Ritva. Now, I just want to say this. My Rebbe Rav Soloveitchik never quoted the Ritva. I was in the Shia for 5 years. I never heard him quote the Ritva. And it always baffled my mind. And I finally came up with a theory as to why he doesn't quote the Ritva. We'll have to check it out, Rabbi Ilson. He'll probably disagree with me. The Ritva was a tremendous lamdi. And that's why the Rav didn't quote it. That sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? The Rav did not want to learn the Ritva because he felt that the Ritva was like a Rosh Hashiva who said Chidushim on a deeper level, and therefore there's no room for me. Rav Soloveitchik wanted to be Mechadish his own Chidushim. In any event, you see a paragraph that's Kosav HaRitva, and you look, we'll go down to the second line, and then we'll come back to the beginning of the first line. Chazir unavela ein gufon aser be'iser cheftza. By the way, this is not a misprint. This Ritva appears 4 times in the writings of the Ritva in 4 different places. The Ritva chazes iba, the same principle, that nevela and treifa, chazir, etc., is not an iser cheftza, but rather an iser gam. This is so counterintuitive that the achronim throughout the generations are trying to understand this ritva. How could it be that shar isurei Torah could go in the vela treifa shkotzma are isurei gavra? That's classic isurei cheftza. Now let's go back a little bit to the paragraph that starts ach. Legabei isurim sha'asra Torah b'chefetz mesuyom. Kigon nevelos utrefos, etc. Nechleku rishonim. Now that phrase nechleku rishonim is only because of this ritva. If not for the ritva, what he calls yesh omrim should be kuliyama lo pligi. Shehem isurei cheftza. Sheguf hadavar, right? The nevela itself, who nesar ala adam. By the way, there's a Gemara in Chulin that's very famous. You all know it, and that's what comes by association to my mind. The Gemara says, Macholas asuris metamtamos es halev. Why is macholas asuris metamtamos halev? Because it's an iser cheftza. The cheftza itself is disgusting for a Jew. Again, let the Goyim eat as much nevel as they want, as much bacon and ham as they want. Tavole and bracha. Could be that you're even allowed to sell them on a Doraisa level, at least Nevelus and Trefus, you could sell bacon to a guy. Okay, the Rabbanan maybe said don't make a living out of it, but whatever it is. Because the Goyim don't have that sensitivity to this Isur Cheftza. So Yesh Omrim, now he quotes the Ritva, Shekol Isurei Torah Hem Isurei Gavra. And in the footnote of a Chaf base, he sends you to this Ritva, that Ritva in Chulin, or Ritva in Kiddushin, or Ritva in Shvuis. The Ritva is very consistent and insistent that Shar Isurei Torah are Isurei Gavra. Hachronim, if you see the paragraph that starts with that word, Makshim al Shitas Rishonim Anal, meaning on the Ritva, Sheshar Isuri Torah Isuri Gavra Lechora Yipale. It's a pele. Lomar al Nevelu Shkotzer Ramosim Sheinam Isuri Cheftza. How could you say such a thing? And apparently the Ritva was a big laptin, and he came up with an Amkus HaTorah that Shar Isuri Torah Isuri Gavra. And now the Achronim are going to rack their brains and try to come up with that lumdus. Why did the Ritva subsume and define all Isurei Torah as Isurei Gavra?
The Torah tells that goyim are not to eat it. Maybe there's nothing wrong with the chaypetz.
Excellent. Maybe it's the rush about Nasir. In other words, a Jew is sanctified with a special level as a result of the fact that a Nazir is sanctified. The rush says the Mele can't drink the wine, so it's a result of the sanctification of the person. So let's take a look as he says, Shnei bi'urim matzanu b'derech harishon. B'derech rishon. Achron, sorry. Okay, so he starts with Rabbi Itzel Karolina, the Keren Orah, and he goes on to the Baruch Tam, who was, I think, if I'm not mistaken, he was somehow related to the Pri Megadim. His name is Rabbi Baruch Frankel Ta'omen. And they say the following. This is called the Ofen Aleph. See it? It starts on page Lamed Gimel, and it goes on to Lamed Dal. He says the following: Hachiluk ben Gavra leCheftza, who es ezo pu'ula Torah herchika v'zhira, right? Umahi hasiba la'avera b'inyanei Torah. I mean, honestly, this sounds like philosophy to me. I don't know if you could get away with this in the Rav Shia. He would say no philosophy, even though he himself was a philosopher, but not in the Shia. And the Shia philosophy was treif, literally, an Isur Cheftza. All right, anyway.
Oh, because he's not learning good.
Right, no, because this is philosophy. How could you possibly speculate on whether or not it's A or B? What's A and B? Lifa'amim, right, so underline the word Lifa'amim, that's A, and then on the next line, Lifa'amim is B. Lifa'amim, ha'iskas his asku shala adam, he sibas avera. That your involvement with the object, your action with the object, your achila or hana, is something which is an avera. The Torah, truth is that every Isur, whether it's Gavra or Cheftza, rack your brains one way or the other, it's always this askus that's an avera. The Torah says don't do X. So whether you call it Isur Gavra and Isur Cheftza, the Torah is saying don't do X, don't eat, or don't eat this, or whatever it might be. However, he says, Lefamim, hachefta atzmo pogum o mekulka. Vehi sibas harchaka. So you don't start with the Maisa Adam, the Askus, the Hana. That's not the source or the origin of the Isur, but rather you start with the Kilkul and the Pagam in the Cheftza. Honestly, if you would stop now, I say that the Ritva makes no sense at all. Here, the Keren Orah and the Baruch Tam are trying to make sense out of the Ritva, but I'm not even a fly on the back of an elephant. But Berzon doesn't understand how this is going to explain the Ritva. Because if you ask me, why did the Torah say don't get involved with eating a nevela? Isn't that not because of the Pagam in the Cheftza? And he says the following. I'm going to give you, he says, a method of measuring. It's like in science, right? You have to do an experiment. So we need a lab experiment to prove whether the Torah is objecting to the hisaskus, or what else does he call it? Right, the achilas hanos, etc., or is the Torah defining a pagam in the Cheftza? How do you evaluate that? Give me what we call in modern Hebrew a moded. Right? Give me a moded. Give me a thermometer. Right? And he says the following. You could tell it within the framework of Zman. How so? He says, Im asiba ba'adamu pulosov, if it's A, which is called an Isa Gavra, then chala Isur mirega sheyesh adam ba'olam. There's no Cheftza in the world. There's no nevela in the world. But the Torah says to the Adam, don't eat nevela. So what then is an Isa Cheftza? Wouldn't you agree that all 613 mitzvahs are addressed to the Adam? Man is created, or a Jew is created right after Har Sinai, and the Torah addresses man or the Jew and says, this is what you're not allowed to do. This is going to whittle down Iser Cheftza to, I think, only one case at all. Why? Because he says the following. He says, Gam lifnei sheyesh hachaticha. If the Torah creates the Iser even before the chaticha exists, then the chaticha, he says, is only a hechetimtza to violate the Aveira. Do you hear this, Rabbosai? An amazing language, hechetimtza. It's a technicality. I only need the Cheftza because otherwise, technically, you can't do the Aveira. But the Aveira and the prohibition emerges even before the Cheftza exists in the world. But im asiba b'Cheftza, if the Oser is in the Cheftza, because the Pagam and the Kilkul in the Cheftza, then Chala Iser Dafka, I added the word Dafka, Mirega Sheniya Ba'olam. If the Chayfetz doesn't exist in the world, then the Iser doesn't exist. Can anyone tell me now why the Iser Neder is an Iser Cheftza? And even the Ritva can't deny the Gemara at the beginning of a Masechet Nedarim.
It wasn't Isser, so it didn't call before it existed.
Correct. Until the Cheftza exists, you can't create a Neder. Once the Cheftza exists, the Torah didn't prohibit that Cheftza. This kikar is a loaf of bread from, what's it called? Pat Lechem? What do they call it here? Pat Bamelech. It's from Pat Bamelech. It's got a hechsher of the, I don't know, the badats. I don't know what it has. And the Torah didn't say you're not allowed to eat this pot. Now you have an Iser in the Cheftza that emerges when the Cheftza becomes also b'neder. But Rabbosai, can you give me another example in the entire Torah of an Iser that only can be generated when the Cheftza exists, but we can't address it to man before the Cheftza exists? I couldn't come up with another case. And that's the Ritva. This is the largest of the Ritva. If you use this moded to determine whether it's an Isa Gavra and Isa Cheftza, there can only be one case of an Isa Cheftza, because you have a Cheftza de hetero, which the Torah says eat and, gouge yourself with this Cheftza. But you created an Isa Cheftza. The Isa and the Cheftza emerges at the time that you create that neder with the Cheftza. If there's no Cheftza, we cannot address the person and prohibit it. No, from the moment that you accepted the Torah at Har Sinai, the Torah addresses you and says, don't eat a bas b'chalav. There's no bas b'chalav in the world. Lu Yitzuyah. That's only a hechetim, so that's a technicality. We got to wait for the bas b'chalav to be there so that you can violate your Isa Gavra.
Well, in theory, you can use the same logic on a neder. The Torah said you can't be over a neder, so when you will make a neder, so you can argue
this explanation seems to be based on the fact that a neder is not essentially a bal yachal tvara, which we said is an Isa Gavra, but an Isa neder is a bal yachal that results from the Cheftza. It's only when the Cheftza becomes asur, only at that point does the Torah say to you a bal yachal. There's no generic Bal Yachel. Bal Yachel is the only exception to the rule. The Torah will only say Bal Yachel when the Cheftza exists and you create a neder on the Cheftza. You're creating a new Iser in the Cheftza. Hence, we have the Ritva. That when the Torah says don't eat nevela, I don't know if there's nevela in the world. Maybe there is, maybe there's not. When the nevela comes around and the animal drops dead without shechita, so now you have a hechetimtza to violate an Isa Gavra. But what is an Isa Cheftza? An Isa Cheftza means that until you have the Cheftza, the Torah never said it's Asur. Now the Isur is generated by the Cheftza because you took a neder on the Cheftza. You created a new chalos in the object, namely that it's Asur. So you start with the object, you create an Isur, chalos Isur in the Cheftza, in that object, hence you have an Isur Cheftza, which is called a neder. And this is the way we're going to determine, this is like the thermometer that we're going to use to determine, to, check the pulse, whether or not it's an Isur Gavra and Isur Cheftza. Wow. I'm telling you, this is brand new. Do we have to go?
No, I just said.
Oh, okay. No, I hope we have another 10 minutes or so. There's so much here. I don't know if we should continue or not. Anyway, now he has open base. So this is the socket oven. Now, I believe that what we learned here in Ofen Aleph is not in line with the Derech Halimud that I was taught. As I said before, I don't think Rav Soloveitchik would tolerate this. This is very philosophical. This is meta halachic. It goes beyond halachic system. But now we're going to take a look at another approach, that of the Avnei Nezer, the Sokochova. And after I see this approach, I'm tempted to write a PhD thesis on the connection between the Avnei Nezer and the brisket derech. I don't know if anyone has ever thought of this idea, but I see that the Avnei Nezer is really avoiding any philosophy. He wants to get down to brass tacks here, defining Isa Gavra and Isa Cheftza without philosophy. He's going to give you a halachic definition of an Isa Cheftza that's going to justify the Ritva. And he says the following. Now, there are two paragraphs here. Because we're pressed for time, I'm going to ask you to sort of skim through the first paragraph on your own, and we'll jump to the second paragraph. Bir achilukhu shebeisa gavra shenesar machmas kidushaso shel ha'adam. The Ritva understands that Isur Gavra means Kedushas HaAdam. Now, Rabbosai, what does that remind you of?
Nazir.
Nazir, exactly. This is the rush of Nazir. That if man is elevated to a certain level, then fair. On your level, you can't eat this food. You can't eat Nevela. You're a Heilige Mensch. So the Isur is Pogem B'Kedushas HaAdam. That's called an Isur Gavra. So where do we start with? We start with Kedushas HaAdam. And therefore, you are enjoined from eating Nevela and Shkotim because of the Kedushas HaAdam. And he has a beautiful, beautiful diuk, Rabbosai. I'm telling you, if the Ritva was here, I don't know how many times I would hug him and kiss him. Look at the pasuk. The pasuk in Nevela says, Anshe Kodesh Tiyun Li. What does it start with? Anshe Kodesh starts with the Gavra, the Kedushas HaGavra. So when you're enjoined from eating the velas and treifas, it's because of your Kedusha. Hence, according to the Ritva, all Isurim are Isurei Gavra. What then is an Isur Cheftza? Isur Cheftza, Dover Sha'adam also asoso machmas Kedushas HaChefetz. Isn't this brilliant? He's saying that there's something that's Kedushas HaAdam, and that generates the Isur. There's something called Kedushas HaChefetz. Rabbosai, what would be your classic case before Nedarim? Hegdesh. This is why many Rishonim hold that a neder has to be b'atfasa. If you don't have atfasa, you don't say kikar zu alai konam, which means karman, then it's not a neder. Because what are you doing? You are creating kiddush on a cheftza. And even if I hold like those Rishonim who don't require atfasa, what I'm saying is, for me, I have created a new world. Right? This is, if anyone knows a little philosophy, this is called phenomenology. Right? I studied that in graduate school. And when I wanted to go out with a certain Rosh Hashiva's daughter, so the Rosh Hashiva who only spoke Yiddish, he had very broken English. He says to me, "Und was lernst du in university? And what are you studying in university?" I told him phenomenology. Was it does? So I gave him a 2-hour lecture on phenomenology. No, it was really only 5 minutes. At the end, he says, "Sehr good." He didn't understand a word I said, but he said, "Sehr good." The bottom line is I got the date. I didn't marry that girl, but I got to do. Anyway, so there's something called phenomenology. It's all based on Cartesian philosophy, and it means that reality is in the perception of the perceiver. That's reality. There is no objective reality. So that's called phenomenology. The founder of which was a Jew, by the way. His name was Husserl. He probably didn't even know what it meant to be a Jew, but that's irrelevant. Yeah. It's like it's like Freudian psychology. I mean, Freud was Jewish by birth, but that's about it. In any event, so what is phenomenology here? Phenomenology tells me that in my perception, this kikar has kedusha to it. It's like a carbon. So the word Iser here means kedusha, like the Ramban says on Kedoshim Tiyu, Tiyu Prushim, right? Kedusha equals Iser. So when we say Asher Kidsharim Vitzosav Vitzivanu, it means because we have all these Surim, that gives us Kedusha. So an Iser Neder is Kedusha Sachefetz. Memela, I only have two categories in the set that's called Iser Cheftza. Two categories of Isurim that have the lowest common denominator, that they evolve and emanate from the Kedusha Sachefetz. Number one, Hegdesh, and number two, Nedarim. And Nedarim is like Hegdesh. And now he quotes the Gemara that says, Yesh me'ila b'konomos. That if a person takes a konom and then he enjoys it, he's chayv mishum me'ila. What does that mean? Why should he be chayv mishum me'ila? Me'ila is when you steal from Hegdesh. The answer is that Nedarim is Hegdesh. This, I believe, is the brisket derech. Again, I never heard anything from the Rav or saw anything from the Rav about what's the difference between Isa Gavra and Isa Cheftza. But I have no doubt in my mind, not a stitch of a doubt in my mind. I'm willing to take a shvu doraisa, go to the Rav's kever in Boston, and say to the Rav, this is the difference between Isa Gavra and Isa Cheftza according to the Ritva. I'm really convinced. Now, in the next paragraph, he quotes Reb Shimon Shkop. Now, I have to tell you that Reb Shimon Shkop was a very deep thinker. So deep that he crossed the red line, so to speak, meaning he's not a real classic brisker. And like yeshivas like tells that are very lumdish and very profound, they are influenced by Reb Shimon Shkop. Because Reb Shimon took lumdish one step further. Famous story about Reb Shimon walking arm in arm with Reb Chaim Brisker. And Reb Shimon told Reb Chaim that Ishus is mischadish b'chol rega v'rega. Every moment there's a new Ishus. So Reb Chaim said to him, Oy bazoi, kum tira mazel tov. See, that's where Reb Chaim said you're going too far. There's a limit, a gvul, not to pass. So Reb Shimon adds another philosophy here. He says, you'll take a look in the paragraph Ke'en on the third line, Kol macholos asuros, Mataras ha'isur avur ha'adam shelo yizgoel b'dvarim ha'metamtimim es hagufa nefesh. So I quoted to you the Gemara in Chulin before that macholos asuros metamtim es halev as a proof that the Vela Treif is an Isur Cheftza. He's saying just the opposite. Why is it metamtim es halev? Because of the Isur Gavra. Why? Because it's goel nefesh for the Gavra. Then yesh tashmish asur or isur shulamatora acheres. Kemo dvarim hamukudoshin she'asur Torah lizar v'lenochim shelo yischal hakodesh. So what's the difference? The offense rachkat Torah pula zu k'dei lishmar sachefta mipnei ha'adam. It's not that the adam is being protected from the chefta, but rather the chefta is being protected from the adam. And he develops this even further in Chidushei Agon Reb Shimon Shkop, and he says Kol Isura. Now at this point, Rabbosai, because we don't have too much time, I want to know if these two paragraphs, one that says B'Chidushei Agon Reb Shimon Shkop, and the other one that says Aval Nedarim, I want to analyze those two paragraphs, and I have a contention that these two paragraphs, in a sense, merge the two approaches, meaning he's going to go back now. Again, this is just Berzon talking. Back now to the Keren Ora and the Baruch Tam. You remember that Moded, did the Torah prohibit this action even before the Cheftza exists, or only after the Cheftza emerges as an entity in reality, then you can create the Isur, and that's called an Isur Cheftza. I think that's where he's taking us here. He says, what?
That was my first reaction when I started reading it.
Okay, let's see. He says the following. Kol Isurei Torah, on the second line of the paragraph of Chidush, Yesh Lem Siba Mukdemes. What does that word Mukdemes mean? Sometimes Reb Shimon speaks a very highfalutin language, very abstract. I think the word Mukdemes means that even if the Cheftza doesn't exist, the Iser is makdim the Cheftza, like we said before in the Keren Orah. Shemishum kach is hira Torah laosor bachila o ba'ano kegon chelev treifa mishum sibazu. Oh, he has something in brackets here. Let's see. Shachaticha zos liolam hi misug hazeh also. I think the word liolam here, I don't know, I'm emphasizing the word liolam. I'm building my whole thesis on liolam, means even before the Cheftza exists in the world. His hira Torah, Sheritzonah, the will of the Torah, Shalo Yochal Yisrael Chelev v'Chadome. V'im Kain. Lo Shayach Lomer Sheyesh Chalos Iser. What does Reb Shimon mean by Chalos Iser? Again, the Iser is Mukdemes. What does that mean, Mukdemes? The way we're interpreting the Reb Shimon. It didn't even exist yet. There's no Nevela in the world. Correct? That's Mukdemes. So what does he mean now when he says there's no chalos Iser? What does he mean chalos Iser? No one's following me?
Later.
No, I think what he means by there's no chalos Iser, meaning there's no hischadshus Iser. Chalos Iser means that you create a chalos Iser. As opposed to an aver mukdemes, you don't create a chalos Iser. The Torah already addressed you and prohibited you. Is lo shayach lomer in the case of chelev, you can't say yesh chalos Iser means hischadshus Iser miyuchad b'chefza atzma. Ela poshet shatorah his hiret ha'adam. The Torah is saying, man, stay away from this chefza. Let's fast forward. Avol Nedarim yesh eze shinui b'chefza. What does shinui mean? A chalos Iser. In other words, look at this object. If you look at it with human eyes, physical eyes, has anything changed because you said kikar zu alai karma? Nothing changed physically. But yet, something has changed. That's called a chalos Iser. You've created a new object, which is a chalos Iser. That's an Iser Cheftza. If you haven't created a new chalos Iser, then it's an Iser Gavra. And the Torah is saying, whether the Cheftza exists or not, that's a question of Heichet Timtza, but the Torah is prohibiting you. What is an chalos Iser? What does the word chalos Iser indicate? That phrase indicates that we're in a halachic universe. We're not in the physical universe. When the Torah says chelev is asur and avel is asur, it's a physical reality. But in the case of neder, there's no change in the physical reality. So it must be by definition that the change is in the legal halachic status of the object. That's called a chalos Iser. And that could only apply in the cases of Hegdesh and Neder, where the object doesn't change. You've created a new chalos Iser, even though there's no shinui in the object. And therefore, the Iser is totally dependent and generated by the object. Kevet shlo nikar lanu b'chefetz hanoder shum shinui b'metzius, shemachalekes beino levein chefza acherim, chefza mutarim, muchrach shashinui b'kach shechal Iser b'chefza. There's a new moment in time when the Iser is chal. So again, I don't know if I'm reading this properly because I'm very much influenced by what we saw in the Baruch Tam and the Keren Orah. But I think he's saying that an Iser Cheftza means his chadshus chalos Iser al pidin in the Cheftza itself. And if there's a chadshus chalos Iser in the Cheftza itself, then it means that the Iser is totally inherent and generated by the Cheftza, and that makes it into an Iser Cheftza. So also we're going to stop here. Thanks everyone for coming. And what I wanted to get to, but again, time is limited, is number ches. And number ches, I need your help. I honestly, this is Reb Shmuel Rozovsky. Reb Shmuel Rozovsky is Rashiva Panovich, is also very much influenced by Reb Shimon Shkop and that whole movement. And I think this is like, I'm very fascinated by it because there's machlokas here between the Minchas Chinuch and the Kilos Yaakov, the Stipler. So there's a lot of good stuff here, but I don't understand it yet. Because again, I was trained in a certain way of thinking, and this is a whole different way of thinking. Okay, then, so I wish everyone a great week. Little propaganda here, if anyone's interested. Tomorrow night I have a shiur in Alon Shvut. We're learning a fascinating parak, which is called Ben Sorer Umore. That's in Alon Shvut. In this weather, I hope we can.
Okay.
That's at 7:30. I have a wonderful group of guys. 7:30 Ma'ariv, and we start the shiur at 7:45. And both Wednesday and Thursday, I'm in Zayt.
Tomorrow is Wednesday.
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant to say tonight. Did I say tomorrow? I meant to say tomorrow means the next year. So tonight at 7:30. Yeah. At 7:30, we have Ma'ariv in the main Beit Knesset of Alon Shvut. I'm sure you know these guys. They're wonderful, wonderful guys in the 40s, 50s, different age brackets. And that's Masechet Sanhedrin. And then on Wednesday, that's tomorrow, we're in Zayit, and that's in Mishkan Tzipora, and we're learning Masechet Makis, also very, very profound. And there we're going to really get into Reb Shmuel Rozovsky, heavy, heavy. On Thursday, we're in Zayit at Shirat David. We'll be singing with David together. Just kidding. And I'm trying a series which I think has never been touched on. It's called From Brisk to Breslov. And to try to find the previous HaTorah in Brisk Alumdus. And that's based on Rabbi Nosson of Breslov. And then I hop over for a Parsha shiur to what I call the Moroccan shul. That's also in, actually it's not in Zayit, it's the next neighborhood over. What's it called? Dekel, I think.
Dekel.
And it's called Mishkan. I still don't have the name down straight. Mishkan, Esther, Rivka, Oel Shimon Esther.
I think that's Gavra.
Oh, Geffen.
Yeah.
Okay, then. And if you want to hear me in Geffen, that's during the day. It's interesting what's going on there in Geffen. It's like a senior kollel of Moroccans. Very fascinating. The guy who organizes it is actually an Ashkenazi. I don't know if you know Steve Solomon from Mishkan Tzipora. So I teach there twice during the week. Okay then, Rabosai.
Thank you. The problem is now, once we explain the Ritzvah, is now like, how do you go back?
No, I have no problem going back. I mean, I'm still trying to digest the Ritzvah, you know.
Like, how do you unsee something?
It puts in context why a